The Music Teacher by John Cheever. It all seemed to have been arranged. Seton sensed this when he opened the door of his house that evening and walked down the hall into the living room. It all seemed to have been set with as much care as, in an earlier period of his life, he had known girls to devote to the flowers, the candles, and the records for the phonograph. This scene was not arranged for his pleasure, nor was it arranged for anything so simple as reproach. "Hello," he said loudly and cheerfully. Sobbing and moaning rent the air. In the middle of the small living room stood an ironing board. One of his shirts was draped over it, and his wife, Jessica, wiped away a tear as she ironed. Near the piano stood Jocelyn, the baby. Jocelyn was howling. Sitting in a chair near her little sister was Millicent, his oldest daughter, sobbing and holding in her hands the pieces of a broken doll. Phyllis, the middle child, was on her hands and knees prying the stuffing out of an armchair with a beer can opener. Clouds of smoke from what smelled like a burning leg of lamb drifted out of the open kitchen door into the living room. He could not believe that they had passed the day in such disorder. It must all have been planned, arranged, including the conflagration in the oven for the moment of his homecoming. He even thought he saw a look of inner tranquility on his wife's harassed face as she glanced around the room and admired the effectiveness of the scene. He felt routed but not despairing, and standing on the threshold he made a quick estimate of his remaining forces and settled on a kiss as his first move. But as he approached the ironing board, his wife waved him away, saying, "Don't come near me. You'll catch my cold. I have a terrible cold." He then got Phyllis away from the armchair, promised to mend Millicent's doll, and carried the baby into the bathroom and changed her diapers. From the kitchen came loud oaths as Jessica fought her way through the clouds of smoke and took the meat out of the stove. It was burned. So was almost everything else, the rolls, the potatoes, and the frozen apple tart. There were cinders in Seton's mouth and a great heaviness in his heart as he looked past the plates of spoiled food to Jessica's face, once gifted with wit and passion, but now dark and lost to him. After supper, he helped with the dishes and read to the children, and the purity of their interest in what he read and did, the power of trust in their love, seemed to make the taste of burned meat sad as well as bitter. The smell of smoke stayed in the air long after everyone but Seton had gone up to bed. He sat alone in the living room, recounting his problems to himself. He had been married 10 years, and Jessica still seemed to him to possess an unusual loveliness of person and nature. But in the last year or two, something grave and mysterious had come between them. The burned roast was not unusual, it was routine. She burned the chops, she burned the hamburgers, she even burned the turkey at Thanksgiving, and she seemed to burn the food deliberately, as if it was a means of expressing her resentment toward him. It was not rebellion against drudgery. Cleaning women and mechanical appliances, the lightening of her burden, made no difference. It was not, he thought, even resentment. It was like some subterranean sea change, some sexual campaign or revolution stirring, unknown perhaps to her, beneath the shining and common appearance of things. He did not want to leave Jessica, but how much longer could he cope with the tearful children, the dark looks, and the smoky and chaotic house? It was not discord that he resisted, but a threat to the most healthy and precious part of his self-esteem. To be long-suffering under the circumstances seemed to him indecent. What could he do? Change, motion, openings seemed to be what he and Jessica needed, and it was perhaps an indication of his limitations that in trying to devise some way of extending his marriage, the only thing he can think of was to take Jessica to dinner in a restaurant where they had often gone 10 years ago when they were lovers. But even this he knew would not be simple. A point-blank invitation would only get him a point-blank bitter refusal. He would have to be wary. He would have to surprise and disarm her. This was in the early autumn. The days were clear. The yellow leaves were falling everywhere. From all the windows of the house and through the glass panes in the front door, one saw them coming down. Seton waited for 2 or 3 days. He waited for an unusually fine day. And then he called Jessica from his office in the middle of the morning. There was a cleaning woman at the house, he knew. Millicent and Phyllis would be in school, and Jocelyn would be asleep. Jessica would not have too much to do. She might even be idle and reflective. He called her and told her he did not invite her to come to town and to have dinner with him. She hesitated. She said it would be difficult to find someone to stay with the children. And finally she succumbed. He even seemed to hear in her voice when she agreed to come a trace of the gentle tenderness he adored. It was a year since they had done anything like dining together in a restaurant. And when he left his office that night and turned away from the direction of the station, he was conscious of the mountainous and deadening accrual of habit that burdened their relationship. Too many circles had been drawn around his life, he thought, but how easy it was to overstep them. The restaurant where he went to wait for her was modest and good, polished starch, smelling of fresh bread and sauces, and in a charming state of readiness when he reached it that evening. The hat-check girl remembered him, and he remembered the exuberance with which he had come down the flight of steps into the bar when he was younger. How wonderful everything smelled. The bartender had just come on duty, freshly shaved and in a white coat. Everything seemed cordial and ceremonious. Every surface was shining, and the light that fell onto his shoulders was the light that had fallen there 10 years ago. When the head waiter stopped to say good evening, Seaton asked to have a bottle of wine. Their wine, iced. The door into the night was the door he used to watch in order to see Jessica come in with snow in her hair, to see her come in with a new dress and new shoes, to see her come in with good news, worries, apologies for being late. He could remember the way she glanced at the bar to see if he was there, the way she stopped to speak with the hat-check girl and then lightly crossed the floor to put her hand in his and to join lightly and gracefully in his pleasure for the rest of the night. Then he heard a child crying. He turned toward the door in time to see Jessica enter. She carried the crying baby against her shoulder. Phyllis and Millicent followed in their worn snowsuits. It was still early in the evening, and the restaurant was not crowded. This entrance, this tableau, was not as spectacular as it would have been an hour later, but it was, for Seaton at least, powerful enough. As Jessica stood in the doorway with a sobbing child in her arms and one on each side of her, the sense was not that she had come to meet her husband and through some breakdown in arrangements had been forced to bring the children. The sense was that she had come to make a public accusation of the man who had wronged her. She did not point her finger at him, but the significance of the group was dramatic and accusatory. Seaton went to them at once. It was not the kind of restaurant one brought children to, but the hat-check girl was kindly and helped Millicent and Phyllis out of their snowsuits. Seaton took Jocelyn in his arms, and she stopped crying. The babysitter couldn't come, Jessica said, but she hardly met his eyes, and she turned away when he kissed her. They were taken to a table at the back of the place. Jocelyn upset a bowl of olives, and the meal was as gloomy and chaotic as the burned suppers at home. The children fell asleep on the drive back, and Seaton could see that he had failed or been outwitted again. He wondered for the first time if he was dealing not with the shadows and mysteries of Jessica's sex, but with plain fractiousness. He tried again, along the same lines. He asked the Thompsons for cocktails one Saturday afternoon. He could tell that they didn't want to come. They were going to the Carmignols. Everyone was going to the Carmignols, and it was a year or more since the Seatons had entertained. Their house had suffered a kind of social infamy. The Thompsons came only out of friendship, and they came only for one drink. They were an attractive couple, and Jack Thompson seemed to enjoy a tender mastery over his wife that Seaton envied. He had told Jessica the Thompsons were coming. She had said nothing. She was not in the living room when they arrived, but she appeared a few minutes later carrying a laundry basket full of wash, and when Seaton asked her if she wouldn't have a drink, she said that she didn't have time. The Thompsons could see that he was in trouble, but they could not stay to help him. They would be late at the Carmignols. But when Lucy Thompson had got into the car, Jack came back to the door and spoke to Seaton so forcefully, so clearly out of friendship and sympathy, that Seaton hung on his words. He said that he could see what was going on, and that Seaton should have a hobby, a specific hobby. He should take piano lessons. There was a lady named Miss Deming, and he should see her. She would help. Then he waved goodbye and went down to his car. This advice did not seem in any way strange to Seaton. He was desperate and tired, and where was the sense in his life? When he returned to the living room, Phyllis was attacking the chair again with the beer can opener. Her excuse was that she had lost a quarter in the upholstery. Jocelyn and Millicent were crying. Jessica had begun to burn the evening meal. They had burned veal on Sunday, burned meatloaf on Monday, and on Tuesday the meat was so burned that Seaton couldn't guess what it was. He thought of Miss Deming and decided she might be a jolly trollop who consoled the men of the neighborhood under the guise of giving music lessons. But when he telephoned, her voice was the voice of a crone. He said that Jack Thompson had given him her name, and she said for him to come the next evening at 7 o'clock. As he left his house after supper on Wednesday, he thought that there was at least some therapy in getting out of the place and absorbing himself in something besides his domestic and business worries. Miss Deming lived on Bellevue Avenue on the other side of town. The house numbers were difficult to see, and Seaton parked his car at the curb and walked, looking for the number of her house. It was an evening in the fall. Bellevue Avenue was one of those back streets of frame houses that are irreproachable in their demeanor, their effect, but that are ornamented through some caprice with little minarets and curtains of wooden beading, like a mistaken or at least a mysterious nod to the faraway mosques and harems of bloody Islam. This paradox gave the place its charm. The street was declining, but it was declining gracefully. Its decay was luxuriant, and in the backyards roses bloomed in profusion and cardinals sang in the fir trees. A few householders were still raking their lawns. Seaton had been raised on just such a street, and he was charmed to stumble on this fragrant of his past. The sun was setting. There was a show of red light at the foot of the street, and at the sight of this he felt a pang in his stomach, as keen as hunger. But it was not hunger, it was simple aspiration. Oh, to lead an illustrious life. Miss Deming's house had no porch, and may have needed paint more than the others, although he could not tell for sure now that the light had begun to fade. A sign on the door said, "Knock and come in." He stepped into a small hallway with a staircase and a wooden hat rack. In a farther room he saw a man as old as himself bent over the piano keys. "You're early," Miss Deming called out. "Please sit down and wait." She spoke with such deep resignation, such weariness, that the tone of her voice seemed to imply to Seaton that what he waited for would be disgusting and painful. He sat down on a bench under the hat rack. He was uncomfortable. His hands sweated, and he felt painfully large for the house, the bench, the situation. How mysterious was this life, he thought, where his wife had hidden her charms and he was planning to study the piano. His discomfort got so intense that he thought for a moment of fleeing. He could step out of the door into Bellevue Avenue and never come back again. A memory of the confusion at home kept him where he was. Then the thought of waiting as a mode of eternity attacked him. How much time one spent waiting, in dentists' and doctors' anterooms, waiting for trains, for planes, waiting in front of telephone booths and in restaurants. It seemed that he had wasted the best of his life in waiting, and that by contracting to wait for piano lessons he might throw away the few vivid years that were left to him. Again he thought of escaping, but at that moment the lesson in the other room came to an end. "You've not been practicing enough," he heard Miss Deming say crossly. "You have to practice an hour a day without exception, or else you'll simply be wasting my time." Her pupil came through the little hall with his coat collar turned up so that Seaton couldn't see his face. "Next," she said. The little room with the upright piano in it was more cluttered than the hall. Miss Deming hardly looked up when he came in. She was a small woman. Her brown hair was streaked with gray, braided and pinned to her head in a sparse coronet. She sat on an inflated cushion with her hands folded in her lap and moved her lips now and then with distaste as if something galled her. Seaton blundered into the little piano stool. "I've never taken piano lessons," he said. "I once took cornet lessons. I rented a cornet when I was in high school. We'll forget about that," she said. She pointed out middle C and asked him to play a scale. His fingers in the bright light from the music rack looked enormous and naked. He struggled with the scale. Once or twice, she rapped his knuckles with a pencil. Once or twice, she manipulated his fingers with hers. And he had a vision of her life as a nightmare of clean hands, dirty hands, hairy hands, limp and muscular hands, and he decided that this might account for her feeling of distaste. Halfway through the lesson, Seaton dropped his hands into his lap. His irresolution only made her impatient, and she placed his hands back on the keys. He wanted to smoke, but on the wall above the piano there was a large sign that forbade this. His shirt was wet when the lesson ended. "Please bring the exact change when you come again. Put the money in the vase on the desk," she said. "Next!" Seaton and the next pupil passed each other in the doorway, but the stranger averted his face. The end of the ordeal elated Seaton, and as he stepped out into the darkness of Bellevue Avenue, he had a pleasant and silly image of himself as a pianist. He wondered if these simple pleasures were what Jack Thompson had meant. The children were in bed when he got home, and he sat down to practice. Miss Deming had given him a two-handed finger drill with a little melody, and he went over this again and again for an hour. He practiced every day, including Sunday, and sincerely hoped when he went for his second lesson that she would compliment him by giving him something more difficult. But she spent the hour criticizing his phrasing and fingering and told him to practice the drill for another week. He thought that at least after his third lesson he would have a change, but he went home with the same drill. Jessica neither encouraged him nor complained. She seemed mystified by this turn of events. The music got on her nerves, and he could see where it would. The simple drill, with its melody, impressed itself even onto the memories of his daughters. It seemed to become a part of all their lives, as unwelcome as an infection and as pestilential. It drifted through Seaton's mind all during the business day, and at any sudden turn of feeling, pain or surprise, the melody would swell and come to the front of his consciousness. Seaton had never known that this drudgery, this harrying of the mind, was a part of mastering the piano. Now, in the evening after supper, when he sat down to practice, Jessica hastily left the room and went upstairs. She seemed intimidated by the music, or perhaps afraid. His own relationship to the drill was oppressive and unclear. Taking a late train one evening and walking up from the station past the Thompsons, he heard the same pestilential drill coming through the walls of their house. Jack must be practicing. There was nothing very strange about this, but when he passed the Carmagnoles and heard the drill again, he wondered if it was not his own memory that made it ring in his ears. The night was dark, and with his sense of reality thus shaken, he stood on his own doorstep thinking that the world changed more swiftly than one could perceive, died and renewed itself, and that he moved through the events of his life with no more comprehension than a naked swimmer. Jessica had not burned the meat that night. She had kept a decent supper for him in the oven, and she served it to him with a timidity that made him wonder if she was not about to return to him as his wife. After supper, he read to the children and then rolled back his shirt sleeves and sat down at the piano. As Jessica was preparing to leave the room, she turned and spoke to him. Her manner was pleading, and this made her eyes seem larger and darker, and deepened her natural pallor. "I don't like to interfere," she said softly, "and I know I don't know anything about music, but I wonder if you couldn't ask her, your teacher, if she couldn't give you something else to practice. That exercise is on my mind, so I hear it all day. If she could give you a new piece." "I know what you mean," he said. "I'll ask her." By his fifth lesson, the days had grown much shorter, and it was no longer any fiery sunset at the foot of Bellevue Avenue to remind him of his high hopes, his longings. He knocked and stepped into the little house and noticed at once the smell of cigarette smoke. He took off his hat and coat and went into the living room, but Miss Deming was not on her rubber cushion. He called her, and she answered him from the kitchen and opened the door onto a scene that astonished him. 2 young men sat at the kitchen table smoking and drinking beer. Their dark hair gleamed with oil and was swept back in wings. They wore motorcycle boots and red hunting shirts, and their manners seemed developed to a fine point for the expression of lawless youth. "We'll be waiting for you, lover," one of them said loudly as she closed the door after her. And as she came toward Seaton, he saw a look of pleasure on her face, of lightness and self-esteem fade, and the return of her habitually galled look. "My boys," she said and sighed. "Are they neighbors?" Seaton asked. "Oh, no, they come from New York. They come up and spend the night sometimes. I help them when I can, poor things. They're like sons to me." "It must be nice for them," Seaton said. "Please commence," she said. All the feeling had left her voice. "My wife wanted to know if I couldn't have something different, a new piece." "They always do," she said wearily. "Something a little less repetitious," Seaton said. "None of the gentlemen who come here have ever complained about my methods. If you're not satisfied, you don't have to come. Of course, Mr. Purvis went too far. Mrs. Purvis is still in the sanatorium, but I don't think the fault is mine. You want to bring her to your knees, don't you? Isn't that what you're here for? Please commence." Seaton began to play, but with more than his usual clumsiness. The unholy old woman's remarks had stunned him. What had he got into? Was he guilty? Had his instinct to flee when he first entered the house been the one he should have followed? Had he, by condoning the stuffiness of the place, committed himself to some kind of obscenity, some kind of witchcraft? Had he agreed to hold over a lovely woman the subtle threat of madness? The old crone spoke softly now, and he thought wickedly. "Play the melody lightly, lightly, lightly," she said. "That is how it will do its work." He went on playing, borne along on an unthinking devotion to consecutiveness, for if he protested as he knew he should, he would only authenticate the nightmare. His head and his fingers worked with perfect independence of his feelings, and while one part of him was full of shock, alarm, and self-reproach, his fingers went on producing the insidious melody. From the kitchen he could hear deep laughter, the pouring of beer, the shuffle of motorcycle boots. Perhaps because she wanted to rejoin her friends, her boys, she cut the lesson short, and Seaton's relief was euphoric. He had to ask himself again and again if she had really said what he thought he heard her say, and it seemed so improbable that he wanted to stop and talk with Jack Thompson about it, until he realized that he could not mention what had happened. He would not be able to put it into words. This darkness, where men and women struggled pitilessly for supremacy and withered crones practiced witchcraft, was not the world where he made his life. The old lady seemed to inhabit some barrier reef of consciousness, some gray moment after waking that would be demolished by the light of day. Jessica was in the living room when he got home, and as he put his music on the rack, he saw a look of dread in her face. "Did she give you a piece?" she asked. "Did she give you something besides that drill?" "Not this time," he said. "I guess I'm not ready. Perhaps next time." "Are you going to practice now?" "I might." "Oh, not tonight, darling. Please not tonight. Please, please, please not tonight, my love." And she was on her knees. The restoration of Seaton's happiness and a return to them both with a rush left him oddly self-righteous about how it had come about, and when he thought of Miss Deming, he thought of her with contempt and disgust. Caught up in a whirl of palatable suppers and love-making, he didn't go near the piano. He washed his hands of her methods. He had chosen to forget the whole thing. But when Wednesday night came around again, he got up to go there at the usual time and say goodbye. He could have telephoned her. Jessica was uneasy about his going back, but he explained that it was merely to end the arrangement and kissed her and went out. It was a dark night. The Turkish shapes of Bellevue Avenue were dimly lighted. Someone was burning leaves. He knocked on Miss Deming's door and stepped into the little hall. The house was dark. The only light came through the windows from the street. "Miss Deming," he called. "Miss Deming!" He called her name 3 times. The chair beside the piano bench was empty, but he could feel the old lady's touch on everything in the place. She was not there. That is, she did not answer his voice, but she seemed to be standing in the door to the kitchen, standing on the stairs, standing in the dark at the end of the hall, and a light sound he heard from upstairs seemed to be her footfall. He went home, and he hadn't been there half an hour when the police came and asked him to come with them. He went outside. He didn't want the children to hear, and he made the natural mistake of protesting, since, after all, was he not a most law-abiding man? Had he not always paid for his morning paper, obeyed the traffic lights, bathed daily, prayed weekly, kept his tax affairs in order, and paid his bills on the 10th of the month? There was not, in the broad landscape of his past, a trace, a hint of illegality. What did the police want with him? They wouldn't say, but they insisted that he come with them, and finally he got into the patrol car with them and drove to the other side of town, across some railroad tracks, to a dead-end place, a dump, where there were some other policemen. It was a scene for violence, bare, ugly, hidden away from any house, and with no one to hear her cries for help. She lay on the crossroads like a witch. Her neck was broken, and her clothes were still disordered from her struggle with the great powers of death. They asked if he knew her, and he said yes. Had he ever seen any young men around her house, they asked, and he said no. His name and address had been found in a notebook on her desk, and he explained that she had been his piano teacher. They were satisfied with this explanation, and they let him go. Thank you for listening to The Piano Teacher by John Cheever.